online and in person. That is nice to know. So you've been warned. Share this. Oh, shoes. Oh, yeah. Okay, so let me switch over here, trying some new and improved things for us here. We'll see if they actually work, because best laid plans of mice and Eric, and then a bunch of Gaelic after that. Okay, hello again. So good to be with you all. We are spending some time taking a look at going from the Tower of Babel to the birth of Abraham, 2492 BC to 1951 BC. Lots of years, lots of stuff. So we've been looking at the dispersion from the Tower of Babel, how from that, pretty much that one spot, man launched out all across the earth. And we've been spending some time looking at the different places and how the countries we know and understand today got their source from the Bible and the Tower of Babel. We've been actually able to trace it back to these names that are in Genesis chapter 10 and chapter 11, giving us the countries that we all came from. So we're basically going from ourselves back to our native countries, back to the Bible, seeing our legacy there. So we've been taking kind of a zoom out over the long range of time, because this wasn't an overnight trip. It took some time to move and settle. So if I do this right, let's see here, new toys, I know, but let's see if we can get this going here. So you are here. If you weren't sure, this is where we are. So starting from our current locale, we are talking about expanding from the Tower of Babel. So let's say goodbye and put on your seatbelts. And we're looking at the expansion launching from right over here, the city known in archaeology as Eridu. Cain, Adam's grandson, Enoch, named it for his son, Irad. It was rebuilt after the flood. So there are the remains of the Tower of Babel. So we're launching out from here to the different places, and we've taken some time exploring a lot of that. So picking up where we left off last week, we are now looking at Shem's son, Asher, from whom we get Assyria, as we see up here. There's the Tower of Babel area. So we talked about recently how Germany was populated by the descendants of Ashkenaz. Tracing that line, there are a lot of Jewish residents of Germany who referred to themselves as Ashkenazi Jews, etc. But there's another line going into Germany. Now, there's a group I've mentioned, the Church of Christ in Philadelphia, put out a publication called The Trumpet, amongst other things. And they're really big on something here, and I'll share this perspective, just more things to look at and consider. So Asher and Assyria. Here's one of the things they point out. The oldest city in Germany is a city known as Trier, T-R-I-E-R. And they say the locals living there say that city was founded about 2000 BC by the Assyrians. 2000 BC is before Abraham himself was even born. That goes a while back. So they say it was founded by Tribeta, a son of the famous Assyrian king Ninus. In the city, they have an inscription. Trier existed for 1,300 years before Rome was rebuilt. Rome was in the 700 BC, so 1300 puts you about 2000 BC. Wow. To this day, it's a tourist attraction for this reason. So that's interesting. The Greeks talk about the Assyrian capital of Nineveh being built by Ninus. We know from the Bible, as it describes to us in Genesis 11, that it was Nimrod who built Nineveh on into Assyria. Well, this guy, Asher, was known as Ninus II, the second Ninus. He took on the mantle of Nimrod and continued on the explorations as Assyria went on and developed from there. What's interesting too is these Assyrians were known as a white race with fair features, and they stood out amongst these Middle Eastern Arabs here. In fact, in the first century, so from 0 to 100 AD, a guy named Strabo, who was documenting stuff, he described them as white Syrians. Was his description for them. Well, what happened to these folks? Well, as you follow through the Bible, the different nations that came and went in power after Egypt, Assyria, after Assyria was Babylon. Well, when Babylon took out Assyria, they took refuge up here in the north toward the Black Sea. That was during the time of Daniel and Ezekiel, all that, 600s BC. They were still in that area during the time of the book of Esther. In between chapters 1 and 2 of Esther, her husband, King Xerxes, goes off to fight against the Greeks. This is movie 300 and all that stuff. Well, he hires these guys over here, who would be the ancestors of the Germans. He hires these Assyrians from the Black Sea area to help him fight against Greece, and he still loses. If hiring German mercenaries sounds like a foreign concept, well, President Lincoln hired them to help fight the Civil War. So not the first or last time that stuff happened. So they keep migrating across the West, go through another name change. They become known as Scythians. And there are different groups of those. But as the Scythians spread out and branch out, they're given different names by others who are dealing with them. As the Romans and Greeks are dealing with them and fighting with them, they call this one tribe of the Scythians, they call them the Germani, which means war man or warrior, because they're having to fight these people and they're tough, battle-hardened people. So I say, just reminds me of Klingons, as I've said before, but Assyria itself, known in the Bible for being very, very warlike and war-focused in their culture. So that's kind of another thought there for where all that comes from. And that factors into the later prophecy with kings of the north and the south and all that for end time stuff. So that's a little juicy tidbit about Assyria and a connection with Germany, which would not normally come to mind. So now we go through the line of Christ, Noah, Shem, ARPACHSHAD, and then we have SHELAH, EBER, and PELEG, who's alive at the time of the dispersion here. PELEG on down goes to Jesus Christ. So we see from ARPACHSHAD, he has other sons and daughters, including over here. Remember, PELEG was a twin. His twin brother was Joktan. Well, we see the spread of Joktan down here in Saudi Arabia, where the birth of Islam was under Muhammad about 600 years after Christ. And some of these areas still have some of the names. There's, God bless you, place there called the Bisaith Joktan, which is the seed of Joktan. He keeps his name today. And we see that their line spread over into India. So not only do we have spread of people and cultures, but remember, this is confusion of languages too. In fact, as different people are mixing up, the guy I'm looking at for here for this stuff, Bodhi Hodge of Answers in Genesis, he describes the fact and dealing with this right here. He knows some people, of Indian descent who have family back in India. They live just within a couple miles of each other, but because their languages are so different, they can only communicate together in English, even though they're native to India and only a couple miles apart from each other. So languages really got confused as well as all the cultures. So then it spread on from here. The mountain ranges, the Himalayas and whatnot, sort of kept people from going a lot further up that way. So they kind of bounced off and continued on into Southeast Asia. So that's that bit on that extension through ARPACHSHAD coming on down. So, and anytime, stop me as we go, all that stuff. Whether you have a question or just need to take a breath, take it all in. So I'm throwing out all sorts of stuff here. So next on down the line, through Shem, we have Lud, where we got Lydia, Laodicea, and all that stuff. The Lutum and the Jutes go on up to Denmark in that area. That'll come up a little later. So see that going on there. Let's see what else we got here. Through Shem's son Aram, we have the spread here, Carthaginians there. Some of these names we hear mixing with Phoenicians and Canaanites. Up here going into Armenia, which we've seen before. It's got a couple of different sources that led to it. Hull from Aram went on to that. Later on, we'll get to a battle in Armenia involving Nimrod's son and this guy over here in Armenia. So some curious stuff there. But now that we've kind of done that overview on those continents, let's start exploring beyond these land continents. Let's start talking about sea journeys that people made and how they got there. So this is where we're going with Abraham and his line And I keep referring to his sons and daughters after Sarah died through his wife Keturah. I have the bad habit sometimes of referring to her as his second wife. No, actually, technically, she's his third wife, because Hagar is actually described as in the Bible as Abraham's wife also. So through Abraham's third wife, Keturah, all these folks came down to this area. And some of Job's friends are descendants of Abraham and his third wife, Keturah, from these areas when the book of Job takes place and he's dealing with his friends. And that's in between the books of Genesis and Exodus that all takes place. So we're getting ready to see the world of Abraham. This is all the stuff that's leading up to that. So I talked about going beyond. Y'all have heard of land bridges, like the Bering Strait land bridge we hear about in school, you know, from Russia, Siberia, across to Africa, how the Indians could walk, with Native American Indians, as we call them, would walk across there on the land at one point and come into America. And then since then, it's been flooded out and you can't walk across that anymore. Well, once upon a time, these land bridges were exposed. And this is the kind of time frame we're talking about. A few hundred years after, 400 to 500 years after the flood, we're still in that first ice age. So that makes sense. What happened was a lot of water was taken out of the ocean, dropped on the land. So it's not in the ocean, ocean level's lower, or land's exposed. So you can walk across. Makes sense. But something else about all this. So people walked across areas that are now flooded out. Well, not only could people walk across there, they could actually live there. So am I saying that there are areas that are flooded out now that people once lived in before? To that, I would say, yes. This right here is the offshore Japanese temple at Yanagumi-jima. And here, they've got 10 structures here, and there are another 5 off the coast of Okinawa, including what we see here, this ziggurat, just like we see the Tower of Babel design carried out and transferred all over the place, all over across the world, really. So let's take a field trip. So this is, it's over here, little island here off of Taiwan that we're talking about here, for example, to show the extent of how far the Tower of Babel concept extended. It literally did go across the globe. Some coming from our end, here's Hawaii. And then here, right there in that middle of the word Taiwan, is this little island. So if you ever leave Hawaii, you want your plane to have lots of fuel because there ain't nowhere for a long while. I didn't realize, I knew the planet was 7/10 water. Well, here's where it all is. I didn't realize how much that was the case until you take a look at these things. So let's take our field. So here's the Philippines, Taiwan, the mainland, China, and all that, Korea up there. So this is where that island is. So let's leave the Tower of Babel and go take a look at this thing. So here is the island. Right here, Japan's westernmost point as it comes along out here. So we're going to take a look right here. And I've been learning new technology, trying to provide and teach better and stuff. So I was able to put these photographs in here. So let's take a look here. So here again, different shots of this underwater ziggurat temple modeled after the Tower of Babel over here off the shore of Taiwan. Pretty big stones they've got involved here. Just like we talked about the big stones of the pyramids in Egypt. Look at the scale of these stones compared to these divers here. So a lot of work done. Smile, say cheese, etc. There we go. So pretty impressive stuff that was done long before you and I were ever on this planet. So dealing with the water, coming off the flood and all that stuff has been an issue for quite a few. In fact, I mentioned Denmark and the jutes up there earlier. They still do all sorts of large dams to small barriers just to try to fend off the water and get the land to spread out a little bit more. So this has been, so recovering from the flood and the ice age has been an ongoing thing for thousands of years. And so this is a natural result of the work of God and us dealing with the planet that we've been provided. So there's the big mess as we see all the different spreads and directions for all these folks, again, coming off of the Tower of Babel right here in the Persian Gulf. So all of this all over the place, Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, all these things here. So again, this wasn't overnight. This was done over time. Folks would, travel along, set up camp. Some would stay. Kids would say, I'm tired of the small town, and head off and end up coming back and moving in. But you know how that goes. And then, but eventually they'd all spread out to these other places that we see here. Please.
I had read one time, Daniel Boone had said when he was here at moving west.
Yes,
He said,
Westward Ho.
I need at least 40 acres so that I can kill enough animals to feed my family.
Ah, I like it.
So anytime people came a little closer to him than that, he would move. And I'm sure there were plenty of others like him.
Yeah,
Because they did live off the land.
the guy was quite a trailblazer. In fact, we get that phrase because literally they blazed trails and set up paths that none had done before them. So yeah, absolutely. You needed area to provide for yourself and room, just like Abraham and Lot. Hey, we're not going to be able to sustain together with our different camps. We're going to have to split out so that you can tend to yours and I can tend to mine. Exactly the same concept yet. Well, that's what God intended here. He wanted them to be fruitful and multiply and spread out and tend to the earth, because as you depend upon the land, you take care of the land so that it can continue to provide for you. The Native American Indians in California would burn the forests. Why? Because they knew that was healthy and productive for the maintaining of the land that they were living on, that they depended on for their sustainment. So we could learn something from these folks and how we do things. So yeah, so we've got land bridges, not only the Bering Strait one we're famously familiar with, but also back in the day, there's evidence of land bridges connecting some more of this stuff too going on down. So travel from the Middle East across Southeast Asia down to New Zealand, Australia, and all of that, all land bridges and whatnot. Of course, those who travel by boat didn't need to worry about a land bridge. They could hop on their boats and go. And we've seen a lot of seagoing people in our looks at these things so far. So talking about the Philippines right here, the Filipinos, as we look at their ancestry, they come through the Malay Peninsula over here, and from a mix of the Arabs and the Chinese and the Indians from this area, all kind of moved over to the area and became in here the areas of the Philippines. And so coming from Ham through China and the Sinaites, Joktan for India, and Javan, the Greeks, for Japan, coming through all that as well, all those different influences. You see the name Seba down here. There's some, one of the sons of Cush is Seba. So we see some of that carried on in some of the names resulting still today. So again, the languages were confused as well and spread out and different. We have what we call the Romance languages that are similar, the Latin-based languages, Spanish, Romanian, Portuguese, French, modern Italian, all similar in that aspect. But over here, they've got their own way of talking. The Australia, the Aborigines, Tasmania, they spoke variations of one language family that's not like any other. And they've actually done genetic testing recently in India and shown connections to not only Australia, but also coming from Africa, where Cush before the Tower of Babel, along with his brothers Mizraim, Put, Canaan, all spread out. So spreading out from there, came back across. So there's a genetic connection here that we've been able to identify and trace, going from India over to this area. In fact, Australian English, as we know it today, that we're familiar with, that did not exist 200 years ago. There's no such thing as English in Australia. So all good with all that island hopping stuff and spreading out there. What we got next? So I like to be in America. So how did we all get here? Well, there's the idea of the Bering Sea land bridge and all that going across there, Aleutian Islands and all that stuff. Well, here's something that's kind of interesting. Here's a quote from Greg Jackson in a book that happens to be in my library that's called Conservative Comebacks to Liberal Lies. And he sources for what he shares here. This comes from another book by B. Forrest Clayton, Suppressed History, Obliterating Politically Correct Orthodoxies. So yeah, these sound like Eric Cooper books. But anyway, here's what's said here. New scientific evidence has revealed the first people in North America were not Indians from Asia who walked across the Bering Strait land bridge, but were Caucasoids from Europe. These Caucasoids came over on boats along the North Atlantic ice sheets into the eastern seaboard of what's today called the United States. So there we go. That serves to disprove the notion that what we call the Indians were the first to occupy the United States. They actually were not. In fact, way before Columbus, we have evidence of Chinese influence in America on this hemisphere as well. The book, The Asiatic Fathers of America, Chinese and Korean influence over here. Chinese coins have been dug up in British Columbia, where the Powell River Church is, in that area up there. They've also found Chinese written texts down here in Mexico. And so language-wise, we see some of the Native American tribes from Alaska on down into Canada here. Those language families are related to the Chinese and Tibet language family over here in Asia. And one thought is that these folks moved over after Genghis Khan was on his rampage, so they fled for safety over here. But we do know that the descendants of Tubal in Siberia came across they were the folks who came across that bridge. That did happen just a little later than other folks. Also down here, we have the Navajo, the Athabasca natives of them. Their language family is also related to the Chinese and Tibetan languages and some similarities. And even some genetic features are the same between these two groups. Yeah, so kind of some interesting stuff. I mentioned the Olmecs before and a connection with West Africa with the Olmec civilization on the Americas. Well, the Olmecs came before the Mayans, and either they became the Mayans or the Mayans conquered them, but they were before the Mayans. And so these Olmec Indians in the Americas, they had a written language that today we still cannot figure out. Today, to this day, we have not been able to decipher their written language. But we see some similarities with the written language in West Africa with these Olmecs. So there's that connection there. And it was from the line of Cush's son Put, who came over to the north of the Northwest Africa, where we get the Moors that went into Spain and all that, Morocco, all that stuff comes from that line. In South America, the Incas, they've got an interesting legend going back to explain all this stuff. For the Incas, this is a story of their creator god, Virachaca, created human beings from the clay, the earth. He painted his creations with distinctive clothes, gave them different languages and customs that would distinguish them, breathe life into them, cause them to descend into the earth and disperse. So even the Incas have an explanation, somewhat similar, obvious differences, to understand what happened. A lot of these creation myths, a lot of things that people come up with have a basis in truth. It just veers off of it and loses sight of the Bible. In fact, as we know, the most successful lies contain a mix of truth in them. And so that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. And so there are some diversities in these writing styles. We know we read from left to right. Hebrew reads from right to left. You know, some folks we go top down, some don't. So not only is there verbal differences, but there's written differences. Some writing is based on how something sounds. Some writing is based on images and pictures of things. So lots of different ways of doing things. It really got confused and spread out. Again, exactly as we're told in the Bible. So some of the things that have transferred over from one language to another is playing on words. You know me, I like words. In the Bible, word for man is ish, and the word for woman is isha. Well, for us, man is man, woman is woman. So there's that also that wordplay there. And so God has an interesting way of using language to convey a connection and a similarity with things. Nimrod was Enmer-Kar, Enmer the hunter, but we add the D to his name, and that makes him a rebel, someone who rebelled against God. So there's play on words, and names have different significances and meanings. Something else that is transferred across time is the worship of Baal. We see Baal in the Bible, yeah, Ahab and Jezebel and all that stuff, Baal worship, we see a lot of that. Where did that all come from? And how did that transfer across? It came from the Canaanites to the Israelites, as we see. Where did that come from? Baal was a person who was lifted up to be a god and worshipped. His own people, they called him Belas, Bel, or Baal. He's known in the Bible to us as Nimrod with the Tower of Babel. That's where this all started. Either people worshiped him or he wanted to be worshipped himself and established this. So that passed on. And we know for us today, as we see this here, what's the spiritual point of all this? We're looking at two things: the seekings of man and contrasting that with the unchanging goodness of our God. The seekings of man are departing from God, and that's what Nimrod did. We set up this Tower of Babel to make a name for ourselves, and he was very much a tyrant in his government as he was king of Uruk and Eridu and over this whole area. And so we see this elevation of man as our own God and ignoring the one true God who gave us life and this planet to live on. Atheism is just another form of this. Atheism is a religion. Atheism is not the absence of religion, it's the absence of God. Atheism is the religion of man. We know it as secular humanism. Man is elevated to a position that's greater than God. And so we have to be very diligent about as Christians when we say that we believe the Bible, but 6-day creation week and all these other things, those might be more stories that are mythological stories, not really literal and true, but the spiritual points are there. If we ever, and I know this isn't really a problem for you and me, but it is for a lot of people who try to claim Christianity, but then deny some of this stuff. They try to say Genesis 1 through 11, that's more allegory, that's not literal, that's not what really physically happened. Well, the problem is we're doing the same thing. We are putting our understanding above God. God is ultimate, supreme, his word is supreme, and that ends all debate and argument. We look at that, we accept that, we recognize that everything else fits and makes sense. But towers of Babel are still being built today, contrary to God, to elevate man. And here we have a perfect example of it with this quote. Share this as I get me out the way here. Listen to this. John Dunphy in the Humanist magazine, yes, there is such a thing, he said this: I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers. Well, we think of proselytizing as getting someone to leave their faith to come to ours. He's saying public school teachers need to do that. Proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of what theologians call divinity in every human being. Hey, there's something special in man, but it doesn't come from God. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values in whatever subject they teach, regardless of the educational level, preschool, daycare, or large state university. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism. Woe indeed. Parents, it's not that you can't send your kids to public school. It's that you have a responsibility under God to raise your kids, to know what they're being taught. And we need to not live in a bubble. We need to be aware of what's going on in the world around us and be able to train our kids to think for themselves, to see what God has given and provided, hear what they're being told elsewise, and see the difference. But we, as parents who are waging a spiritual war for the sake of our children and our future, as we look forward to Christ's return, and we know the way of the world and man's ultimate Tower of Babel being built, spiritually speaking, contrary to God, heading towards that, we need to know what's being done in opposition to us. And we need to be equipped for this and recognize that there is a conflict that our kids are being thrown into. And for their sake, we need to strengthen them and encourage them and show them the joy and the hope that is found in the gospel and the word of God. Because in this secular humanism, this religion of man, I know man, I am a man. There ain't much hope there. There's not a lot to look forward to there. I can only pump myself up so much. And I know what's in man around me. I can only pump another human being up so much. We all know our sin-infected nature and that we are reliant and dependent upon a wonderfully merciful and compassionate God who stood in our place. And so that's our glory. He's the one who lifts us up to victory. It's not anything we can do on ourselves. And I don't want my 30-year-old kid to be equipped for failure. I want her to be able to see what the world offers, see what the Lord declares, and know for herself where she stands and why, and be able to share that with someone and be on solid footing. So any reactions, thoughts, comments, questions on that? This was in the 70s.
So start going all the way back, because this has been
A lot of this started with John Dewey and the creation of social sciences in the public schools. It was a campaign that was started from the 20s, 30s, 40s onto there, but it really took effect late 50s and 60s. Oh, yes.
Put in place, and it has just gotten to where we are now.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that.
So just as Nimrod, a human being, was elevated and wanted to be elevated as I'm the man, so too we know someday there's going to be someone lifted up as the man. We know in the Bible as the Antichrist. Well, we already have a man. He is the Son of Man, the Lord Jesus Christ.
Baal, you said Baal is Nimrod?
Yes.
So whenever we hear Baal in the Bible,
Yes.
that
That's the deification. That is the God making out of Nimrod.
sacrifice their baby
To Nimrod.
to Nimrod.
Yeah.
That's what it's child sacrifice.
Yeah. And Moloch and some of these other things are different offshoots and variations.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we have the unchanging goodness of God versus all these seekings of man. And we have the consistency and the clarity that comes through Christ versus all this chaos, that all these competing interests that man has, but ultimately going away from God. And like I've said before, when you remove the foundations, when the foundation of God and his word is off the table, anything goes. And you've got no basis for anything. Ken Ham at Answers in Genesis is fond of saying, when atheists complain about certain things in the Bible, they say, well, that's immoral. His response to them is, you're an atheist. You call yourself an atheist? You can't call anything immoral because you have no foundation on which to declare that. What you decide is immoral, someone else might not, because there's no common foundation. That's what moral relativism is. And that's what society is aiming towards. Doesn't matter what was right and true in the past, because we make up our own rules now because we're the boss. It's our life. We're going to do our own thing with it. But guess what? What sounds good to me might not sound good to you. Well, if I want it, I'm going to get it, even if I have to bulldoze over you to do so, because I can justify myself. We're here, if we have a godly respect for each other as brothers and sisters, not only here in the church in Christ, but our fellow man, we all come from Adam, we all come from Noah, that if we recognize one race, the human race, we're not going to insert and impose ourselves over someone else. We're going to respect their freedom, even their freedom to go contrary to God. We're going to try to encourage them and be a witness, but ultimately that's their God-given free will. They answer to God for that. They don't answer to me. Brother John. John Dunphy. He was a humanist. He was very much an activist in this agenda, as Sister Ashley described it. Very much promoting this religion. He's not afraid to call it a religion. This religion of humanism. He was a teacher. He was very much, like I said, an activist, very much a promoter and an influencer in this. He wrote this article in the Humanist magazine, again, back in the 70s, but this was a very big movement. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, magazine, books, and publications. Oh yeah, it's a group. Exactly. So that's a good stopping point for that. So let's see. Do you want to go to the next slide and wrap it up with there? Yeah, so summing it all up, God's got the whole world in his hands. So we have seen the whole spread, basically a big overview over these last couple of weeks of the explosion of population spread across the globe, from the Tower of Babel. And so we will see things carry on from there. And then from here, we're going to get back to the time frame of Peleg, who was alive when the spread started, and what happened in his lifetime as we go from Peleg down to Abraham and see the world that Abraham was born into and that he interacted with and dealt with as God called and worked in his life. And we are spiritual inheritors of what God did through Abraham to this very day. So let's close in Genesis chapter 8. Take a look here. As mentioned Wednesday, when we read from Romans chapter 8, about the whole creation groaning within itself, looking forward to being freed and released from being put under subjection, bearing the weight of our sin's impact upon it. So we see the promise of God, again, looking to the unchanging goodness of our God. Coming off of the flood, let's go to Genesis 8, verses 20 to 22. Genesis 8:20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth. And I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So there's a promise from God, knowing that, people are messed up, they're sin infected. If I destroyed the world every time, because of their sin, I'd have to destroy the world lots of times. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to wait until a day. But until that day, this world is going to continue. And my people are to be stewards of this world. Springtime harvest, seed time harvest, cold heat, summer, winter, day and night, this changing of seasons is going to continue on. And he gives the promise continuing in chapter 9, verses 7 to 13. As for you, be fruitful, multiply, populate the earth abundantly, and multiply in it. God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, all that comes out of the ark, every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you. All flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. I set my bow in the cloud. It shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. This covenant is a one-sided covenant. All the conditions and promises are on the side of God. It's eternal. It still stands today. This did not expire with the law of Moses. No law of Moses here. And this is a promise that we are inheritors of and living and appreciating today. And in fact, to close with a little play on words here, The idea, because those of us who have kind of old school values, we might call them, are told that we are letting the earth get destroyed, right? We're just letting it all go to pot, right? Because we're not being responsible. We're not caring about the environment. Well, the word conservation, where we get the word conservate, okay? Well, that's related to another word. That word is conservative. To be conservative, and let's just go to the meaning of these words, means to preserve and maintain. That's what we're called to do. That's being a good steward. Going back to the original meaning of some words, lucha libre, freestyle wrestling. That's where the liberate comes from. Liberate means that freedom. Okay, classic liberalism. If you did not know, I'm a classic liberal. Classic liberalism is being free to live freely or liberally. I'm down with that. I think that's what God gave us under him. Modern liberalism is to receive freely from the government, or government spends freely, or liberal. And yeah, so that's kind of the change there. Y'all have heard the word conservatorship? What is a conservatorship? A conservatorship is legal responsibilities over the affairs of a person who has been deemed gravely disabled and unable to meet their basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter. Okay? Modern liberalism wants government to be a conservator over the people. That's where in reaction, it's called nanny state. Under God, we don't surrender our responsibility to cradle to grave government. We embrace and maintain our conservatorship over our own household and children, contrary to what we saw from that humanist individual. We maintain and embrace our own stewardship under God of our own God-given lives and this God-given planet. So see, it's not a matter of politics. It's a matter of mindset. It's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of godly foundation or not. And so we are to be liberal in giving people their freedom and free will under God and allowing for that. And we are not to surrender ourselves under the conservatorship of a government. We answer to God. And so we are to be conservators and stewards of what God gave us. So that's what these words were originally meant for and intended, and where our place is to be under that, under the Bible. So with that, any final thoughts, comments, questions from anyone? So he's got the whole world in his hands, and that's what makes the world go around. So we will pick up next week, moving on to getting closer to Abraham from here. So with that, we'll go ahead and close up shop and turn the services back over.